Hi, I'm Josh Block, host of Uncover Escaping NXIVM from CBC Podcasts. I pull back the curtain on the secretive self-help group that experts call a cult and follow one woman's harrowing journey to get out. The podcast was featured in Rolling Stone magazine and named one of the best podcasts of 2018 in The Atlantic. Listen to Uncover Escaping NXIVM on CBC Listen or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Canada's first Prime Minister pulled from his lofty perch above Place du Canada. As the statue hits the ground, Macdonald's head pops off, and the crowd goes wild.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. And today, we're talking about monuments.
In Halifax today, what was supposed to be a protest is turning into a victory rally. At the center of it all, the statue of Edward Cornwallis. Now,
They're supposed to honor moments in our history, but they also influence the way we see the world.
In order to really commit to reconciliation, we need to remove the statue of Johnny MacDonald from the front steps of City Hall.
Today, the push to pull down problematic statues as we examine whose history is being celebrated. Last month, a monument of Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, was toppled in Montreal. But it wasn't the first statue to come down in Canada. A few years ago, another statue of Macdonald was removed from City Hall in Victoria, and the same happened to a statue of Edward Cornwallis on the East Coast. Over the years, countless statues have been vandalized and targeted for removal. Omiyasu Wapasu is a professor at the University of Prince Edward Island in the Department of Education. She's from Saddle Lake, Cree Nation, Alberta, and she has studied how shared public spaces can influence the way we see the world and the way that we see history. She joins me now from Charlottetown. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Phelan.
So how would you say statues shape the way we see public spaces?
They're fundamental. All of the spaces that we are surrounded by shape our perception of that location. Currently, many of us are urban people, and we don't think about how the buildings are shaping our interaction with the human beings and the land around us. And statues contribute very much to that perception of how is this society operating, what are its rules, what are its values, and what does it stand for?
So statues like the one of John A. Macdonald, the one in Montreal, that was also just all over the news, has been given preference to a certain history. Why do you think this is a problem?
I think that it's a problem because it valorizes the one side of the story that Canada wants to share. It valorizes a side of the story that has been violent, resulted in genocide, and created a strong dynamic of inequality within our country that we don't like to acknowledge. And it's embodied in the actions of John A. Macdonald, who is seen by Canadians as a great hero, the architect of Confederation, the creator of the railroads. So somebody that really, forwarded the creation of Canada, but it undermines and hides the story of the actual people who welcomed newcomers to this land, the actual people who had a different worldview and values that could have shaped this country in a different scenario. So it just, it undermines our true history. As Canadians, I think in theory we try to be inclusive, but we can't really even define ourselves as Canadians because of the fact that we don't tell the entire story, and there's only been one story told through these statues, in particular John A. Macdonald. And that statue, I have watched that video a few times of the one that came down in Montreal. It was so big. It's ridiculous.
It was really big. And there's, statues of Macdonald in Charlottetown as well, now where you're based, right? So can you tell me what that one looks like?
Okay, so that one is, fairly cute, actually. It's a lot smaller. I like to think it's the actual size of what John A. Macdonald was. It's, again, right downtown on the corner of Queen Street and Victoria Row. So tourists, locals, everybody's walking by it all the time. He's sitting down with his ankle crossed over his knee, just relaxed on a bench. So one of the favorite things for tourists to do is to actually sit down beside him and take a photo there. And before a person is used to seeing that statue all day, every day, it's like quite common to be like, oh, who's that sitting over there? Like, I felt like that way for the first few weeks that I lived here.
And there are people who want this John A. Macdonald statue removed, right?
Yeah, so what I've been understanding of the history of this taking place here in Charlottetown, there have been some vandalizing of the statue. So someone has been covering it in red paint, which is one of my favorite approaches to the statue. Some people have called for it being taken down. Some people have said, okay, leave the statue, place a plaque with more information about John A. Macdonald's complex history. Some people have been very much in favor of keeping the statue. The local Mi'kmaq community got together a few weeks ago, had a bit of a drumming, and a residential school survivor draped a Mi'kmaq flag over top of John A.'s shoulder, and then discussed her experience of residential school and how painful this reminder was of that experience, and how painful it was that the society in the city was valorizing a human being that destroyed a significant portion of this survivor's life.
And so he's getting covered in red paint. I don't want to say on the regular, but it's something that's happening. You know, what does that red paint signify to you or represent for you?
The red paint represents a couple of things. First of all, the blood that is on John A. Macdonald's hands. So just really demonstrating both that blood as well as the continued existence, resilience, and lifeblood of our nations despite his best efforts to erase, delete, and murder us through various policies, including removal of the buffalo for the purpose of the railroad, the starvation that took place because of the loss of the buffalo, the starvation that took place because of the Indian Act policies, including the reserve system, and the high mortality rate in residential schools. And then the red also representing, in so many of the different national colors of Indigenous people across Turtle Island, red figures quite prominently as one of our colors to represent our nations. And so, again, the power and resilience of our nations and the passion of our existence and our celebration of life.
And, you know, you have a sort of a unique take on vandalism on statues. You argue that this red paint, it should stay on. Can you tell us a bit about why that's your perspective?
So a statue is a static representation of a couple of things. One, it's signifying a history that is past. And two, when the statue appears, is in itself an historical moment. So for whatever reason, this particular city decided, yes, it's 1973, whatever, let's get a grant from the federal government and celebrate John A. Macdonald's, whatever birthday this might have been or something. So it's signifying already at least two moments in history. And I think that the continued vandalism of these kind of statues is an important representation of continued engagement in that history. So we continue to have historical moments and we continue to interact with our history. And by pouring red paint on it, we demonstrate a new way of looking at history. So it's like a historiographical argument, or not to be too academic, but it just demonstrates that as societies and citizens, we continue to change and reevaluate our histories and change it in ways to represent the stories that we need today. And the story that we need today right now is one of Indigenous survivance.
As we've seen, statues and, our sense of history, it can be quite polarizing. What do people say when you explain your perspective to them? Do they change their minds?
Oh, do we ever change anybody's mind? I guess, no, I haven't heard of me changing anybody's mind. Most of these monuments, in terms of their artistic merit, are pretty low, and I have to agree they're not interesting to look at. I have yet to see a Canadian monument in bronze that I find exciting. Art is something that is an exciting way to express ourselves, express our humanity, express our relationships. A bronze bust of somebody who had some kind of historical significance is rather boring. So in my opinion, this kind of approach to a vandalism or changing and interacting with the statue is way more interesting than most of the statues themselves.
And there's a question of who should be commemorated. Who would you like to see commemorated in the future in statue or monument form?
Okay, so that's a really specific question, because I was thinking about how an Indigenous ethic doesn't necessarily entail that kind of permanent mark on the landscape. But if we were going to do that, what I would privilege over just individuals, kind of stories of Indigenous women who I really believe actually made this country, the incredible female Indigenous leaders that we've had, that's the kind of monument I would like to see. And I was also thinking what is more exciting and interesting is the incredible work that so many of our artists do. That would be nice to see because they're so critical and they're so intricate. They're much more interesting to look at. So something by Joy Arcand, something by Adrienne Stimson, something by Rebecca Belmore. That kind of creation of space that can be interacted with and is more interesting to look at and tells a story that is actually more inclusive, more Indigenous, and more celebratory.
Thanks so much for being here today.
Ginaskamtanan, Phelan, thank you. It was lovely to meet you.
Omiyasu Wapasu is a professor at the University of Prince Edward Island. She's Cree, originally from Satellite Cree Nation.
Hi, I'm Michelle Shepard, host of Uncover Sharmini from CBC Podcasts. In 1999, 15-year-old Sharmini Anandavale disappeared on her way to a job that police believed didn't exist. 4 months later, her remains were found in a wooded ravine. I revisit the case that has stayed with me for over 20 years, ever since I first covered it as a cub crime reporter for the Toronto Star. You can find Uncover Sharmini on CBC Listen or on your favorite podcast app.
Hi, I'm Josh Block, host of Uncover Escaping NXIVM from CBC Podcasts. I pull back the curtain on the secretive self-help group that experts call a cult and follow one woman's harrowing journey to get out. The podcast was featured in Rolling Stone magazine and named one of the best podcasts of 2018 in The Atlantic. Listen to Uncover Escaping NXIVM on CBC Listen or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. It's a remarkable photo that went viral over the 4th of July weekend. It's of 4 women in regalia standing by an empty pedestal. It's where a statue of Christopher Columbus used to stand in Detroit. The 110-year-old monument was taken down last month. As protests around the world continue to draw attention to whose statues and whose history are being commemorated. Rosa Maria Zamaron is a Mexican photographer who took the photo, and she joins me now from Detroit.
Hi.
Hi, I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and congratulations again on the photo. Again, it was everywhere.
Yeah, it went pretty viral.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Could you describe it for me, what it looks like?
So what you're seeing is actually a color photograph, and you have 3 women at the base of the statue where it once stood, and then a woman in the fancy shawl dress standing at the top, and she's looking out, and the women are all standing very regal and beautiful, looking at the camera. And yeah, it's a bright, sunny day, super bright, and there's just cars passing by, and it's just in the middle of the city.
So what inspired you to take this photo where Christopher Columbus used to stand?
There's always been, I think, demonstrations and things happening around that in Detroit. Antonio Rafael, he's a person from Southwest Detroit here. I think he put like an axe on its head one time. And it's always been like a topic of conversation on how to figure out how to take it down and then to do something in place of it. And so it's been years of people, protesting and trying to do something. And so I became a part of the Wahweotanang Resurgence group here in Detroit. And it's a grassroots organization based in the city here. And the women decided to make jingle dresses. They wanted to do it for an action that was happening on July 4th with the jingle dresses, and the regalia on the statue. And so obviously that had been on everybody's mind. And so we were like, yeah, let's do it. I think they did the dresses in like 2 weeks, which is unheard of. Just kind of came together, I guess, with 4 women. It was just, I didn't really have to do that much.
You should have shown up with the camera. Yeah.
Courtney right away was like, I'm going to get on top of this. And I'm like, oh, okay. We had little like steps, but the thing is pretty tall. Mm-hmm. And so she just like climbed up. She looked amazing up there. And then everybody just kind of like stood. And I didn't really have to direct anything. And it just came together like magic. It was amazing.
And all these women, they come from different nations, right? And they were wearing, 3 of them were wearing jingle dresses and one was in fancy. But can you tell me a little bit about what the symbolism of the jingle dress is?
So it's a story from, I think, that flu epidemic that happened in the 1900s, the early 1900s. There was a girl that was sick and had a vision about being healed through the stresses, the sound that it makes. She had a vision of what that regalia for her should look like, and she made it. And she was sick, so when she started dancing, she was healed. So it very much correlates to our times right now in the middle of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so that's why they started making these jingle dresses, and that way they can start healing, the land in different areas here in Detroit and outside of it. Mm-hmm. So for me, it just kind of meant like the viewer is part of that. They're seeing that history repeat itself.
Mm-hmm. So did you run into any issues during the shoot? Like, I imagine people had to have stopped and watched or asked questions about what was going on.
They were driving by and honking their horns or just like seeing what was happening. But It wasn't like where I've done stuff where obviously people stop and they get upset or, like the police come and they question you. And like this went seamlessly. It happened so fast and so seamless that I was like, did it really happen? It felt like a dream.
How long were you there for? Like, how long were you guys,
10, 15 minutes. It wasn't even that long. By the time they came up and they came down, and then as soon as Courtney jumped down and jumped off and everybody was standing in a circle, a cop patrol car popped up. And I'm like, oh my God. We narrowly escaped it. Like there was no issue. He didn't stop. He didn't do anything because by that time everybody was off, the pedestal. So
nothing
we're like,
to
well,
see
that was
here.
Nice. Yeah, he didn't even stop to question why everybody was in regalia or, anything like that. So
I think the ancestors were working the red lights that day in Detroit.
Probably. I really believe that. Because they actually did smudge, the area and everything. So I was like, it was working with us. So.
And it did go viral over the 4th of July long weekend. So, I mean, that obviously must hold some significance. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we took the image on July 1st, and then by the next day, it just went viral. And I think it was a really important moment because of the significance of Independence Day here in the United States and how everybody's tired of it, So it gave people like a reason to kind of celebrate for themselves what they wanted to celebrate and not what, you're kind of forced to look at.
And so the photo had like almost 18,000 likes on your Instagram account alone, and then it was in Vogue and all over the place. What was the response by people who were either sharing this photo or, liking this photo? What were people saying about it?
People were just really happy to see this image and like really empowered. And a lot of people were saying that it made them cry. It made them feel super positive, and it felt good to see, representation like that and the way things should have been. And, a lot of people reached out because they're like, that should be the real statue that's there. Like, how are we going to talk to the city about it? So it was overwhelmingly like positive.
How do you feel, though, when you look at this photo now?
I just feel like really proud of these women, and it makes me feel really happy that it got received in the way that it did, because it just means that it pushes people forward. It pushes people to want to do more and to feel that courage to be able to stand up for what they want and what they believe in their own communities.
So on the show today, we're talking about reimagining statues and monuments in public places. For you, why do you think they hold so much power?
Well, I mean, if you think about it with anything, like when you're putting like a statue like that, it holds that energy. It holds those vibes from that time, like the people that it represents. And so having these statues of slave owners, having these statues of all these colonizers, I think is just continuously giving off that negative energy and that pain that needs to be healed.
So if you could pick someone who should be commemorated in statue form, in monument form, who would you choose?
Those women, like all the people that I photographed, feel like should be as statues. Like why not have people that really work hard in their community and try to push forward those positive narratives, and that positive change should be represented.
Yeah, well, I would love to see a fancy dancer atop of that pedestal.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Rosa Maria Zamaron is a photographer based in Detroit. If you'd like to see the image we've been talking about, head to our site, cbc.ca/unreserved. Today we're talking about the controversy around monuments, telling one side of Canada's history. So let's do an experiment. Close your eyes. Unless you're driving, then don't close your eyes. Keep your eyes open and just use your mind's eye. So think about the monuments and statues that are in your town or city. Are any of them Indigenous? Well, if you're in Winnipeg, there are two. Stephanie Cram is a producer at Unreserved, and she's also the host of an upcoming CBC podcast, Muddied Water, 1870 Homeland of the Métis. She's here to share the story of two very different statues of Louis Riel. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk more about the podcast in a minute, but why are there two statues of Louis Riel in Winnipeg, and are they different?
Yeah, so there are two statues of Riel in Winnipeg. There's one where he's looking very statesmanlike, holding a Bill of Rights. It's the type of statue you'd expect to see of a politician. But then there's this other statue where he's naked, his body's contorted, and the statue itself is actually covered by large concrete walls. So it's not really the Riel that you've probably seen in photos. I guess you could say it's a real creative interpretation of who Riel was.
Really sounds like it. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But, most people don't get one statue, and he has two. Why is Louis Riel such an important figure in Manitoba history?
Well, Louis Riel was instrumental in getting Manitoba to join Canada. He was instrumental in what is known as the Red River Resistance, which was the Métis' fight to obtain rights as this new province was being created. It used to be called the Red River Rebellion, but the names changed over the years. The argument being the Métis people weren't really rebelling against Canada. They were resisting the changes that came along with the government. Louis Riel was originally from Manitoba, but moved to Montreal to attend school to become a priest. While there, he heard that the Dominion of Canada was looking to purchase Rupert's Land from the Hudson Bay Company, which is a stretch of land that includes much of Western Canada. Riel came back to Manitoba to help his people, the Métis Nation, stand up to Ottawa. And once here, he formed an interim government which negotiated with Canada a promise of land for the Métis, the protection of the French language, and protections that allowed the Métis to continue to practice Catholicism, because at the time, being Protestant was more in fashion. He helped draft a Bill of Rights, which would later go on to become the Manitoba Act and would help usher Manitoba into Canada. So because of his involvement in all of this, many call Riel the founding father of Manitoba.
Okay, so as we said off the top, there are a few statues in Winnipeg which celebrate Riel. Can you tell me about the first statue that was erected?
The first one erected was the statue of the naked Riel. So as I said, it's 11 feet tall, and it depicts Riel in the nude, and he's distorted, and his body's compressed. So in 1970... for the centennial celebration of Manitoba, the province wanted to recognize Riel as the founding father of the province, so they enlisted the help of artists Marcien Lemay and Etienne Gaboury. The statue was placed on the legislature grounds of Winnipeg, which at the time was quite controversial. So you can imagine a very tall, naked Riel on the legislature grounds. For the podcast, I spoke to Métis lawyer Darren O'Toole, who talked to the descendants of Riel after the statue was put up.
This was back in 1995, I believe it was. I spoke to Augustine Abraham, whose grandmother was Louis Riel's sister. But I can understand it opening up a wound of, when Riel was hanged, what his own lawyers try to plead in his defense was insanity. And so there's this whole history of portraying Riel as insane, crazy, a lunatic, which he was often portrayed as in the newspapers at the time during his trial and things like that. And to have him portrayed that way in public is opening that wound. Because, of course, when a family member is accused of being crazy, it's usually thought, well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree kind of thing. And so, well, the rest must be like that too. And so it can be taken very personally by a family member. For the Métis people, I can understand it too. It's because it was put on the legislature, the grounds of the legislature, it was particularly perceived as insulting. This would not have been done to other Canadian leaders, this kind of betrayal. And why emphasize that particular part of his history, which came after 1870, when the statute on the legislature should be about his founding role in the Manitoba Act.
So that's interesting. So the family felt the statue didn't really capture Riel's life and the important role that he played in creating Manitoba.
Exactly. So once again, the statue was created in 1970. It's the 100th anniversary of Manitoba. So you'd think that they want to capture him in this his statesman-like way as the man who helped draft the Manitoba Act. But it didn't. Here's O'Toole explaining what he saw as the inspiration behind the statue.
The statue's more expressive of what the Canadian state did to Louis Riel. I'm not a psychologist or anything. I don't have any training in that, but I think he had some sort of a nervous breakdown in late 1875, December of 1875. That was largely brought on by the fact that he was hounded by the federal parliament. He had been elected several times to federal parliament and was expulsed. And of course, we were called rebels and filthy half-breeds and things like that. And so we're marginalized in Canadian society in general, but worse in the very province that our ancestors founded. This statue represents that period of our history. I can understand, especially members of Riel's family, not wanting him to be put on public display in that way. But I think that period of his life and that period of our history needs to be on public display in order that it not be forgotten.
That's interesting. So O'Toole is saying that the statue should remain standing as a reminder of that painful history.
Yes, for O'Toole, there is a place for such a statue, but maybe the legislature grounds in Winnipeg wasn't quite the right fit. O'Toole has a really funny anecdote about another Canadian politician, which really makes you question how the statue of Riel came to be in the first place.
You probably wouldn't put a statue of John A. Macdonald drunk and passed out on the Parliament grounds in Ottawa. A lot of people would consider that insulting, especially back in the 1970s, before a lot of the stuff going on now about John A. Macdonald's reputation and his role in cultural genocide and that.
John A. Macdonald was documented to be a bit of a drinker. That's very well known. But I guess you probably wouldn't want to capture that in statue form.
Probably not.
No. So with the Métis of Manitoba frustrated over the naked Riel statue, is it still there? What happened to it?
Yeah, eventually the statue was removed, but it took 26 years to actually remove it. In 1994, the controversial statue was removed, and 2 years later, a statesman-like statue of Riel holding a Bill of Rights was put behind the legislature grounds overlooking the Assiniboine River. And as for the controversial statue, the naked one, it's now located on the grounds of the Université de Saint-Boniface. It might not be an appropriate statue for the legislature grounds, but it is a statue that captures the plight of the Métis in Manitoba, a history that, like O'Toole says, should not be forgotten, especially now in 2020.
Well, I think it's all the more important right now, unfortunately, the current political climate in Manitoba. The COVID-19, of course, has affected the celebrations that were supposed to take place for the 150th anniversary of the creation of Manitoba. But from what I understand, the role of the Louis Riel and of the provisional government in founding Manitoba was largely being ignored. And so historically, after 1885, we're termed the forgotten people because we basically disappear from the narrative of Canadian history after 1885. Of course, we still continue to exist. And so we have history repeating itself a little bit in that regard, where we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of Manitoba, and yet it's been done as if the Métis didn't exist or didn't play a role in that, and in particular, Louis Riel's role. And so I think it's that much more important to celebrate Riel's role in founding Manitoba. And unfortunately, in our own province, in 2020, we find ourselves again in a position of resistance. What we're resisting nowadays is not so much the unilateral annexation like in 1869, 1870, but what we're resisting is the creation of a narrative where we're treated as if we're inexistent or unimportant.
The history of the Métis people that is often forgotten, is left out of textbooks, is what we'll be covering in the podcast, which, as O'Toole mentioned, is important to cover right now since the province just turned 150 years old.
I think the words that really stood out for me in that clip was the forgotten people. Seems like a very apt way of putting it. So if people want to hear more about the history of the Métis in Manitoba, how can they hear the podcast?
The podcast will be out later this month, but to get notifications on the new season, subscribe to CBC Muddied Water on your favorite podcast app, and you can catch up on the first season, which is about the 1919 strike here in Winnipeg.
Thanks for being here, Stephanie.
Yeah, no problem.
Stephanie Cram is a producer here at Unreserved and the host of Season 2 of the CBC Manitoba podcast, Muddied Water, 1870, Homeland of the Métis. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson, talking all about monuments on the show today, who they celebrate, and whose history is being told.
I was deeply disappointed by the vandalism.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says it was wrong for activists to pull down a monument of Sir John A. Macdonald in Montreal's downtown core. Trudeau says some of the country's past leaders have done questionable things, but acts of destruction are the wrong way to advance the fight for equality.
But we are a country of laws, and we are a country that needs to respect those laws, even as we seek to improve and change them.
Conversations about statues coming down isn't new to Tim Fontaine, and making fun of them isn't either. Pipeline stalled after First Nations erect statues of Canada's first Prime Minister in Perth. Conservatives kick off new Statues Before People campaign. Those are just a couple of the headlines Tim has written as editor and Grand Chief of Walking Eagle News, an Indigenous satirical website. He's Anishinaabe from Saugeen First Nation in Manitoba, and he's here to talk about how statue discourse is the gift that just keeps on giving. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Thanks.
So you've been writing jokes about statues coming down for years.
Yes.
Do you have any favorites?
The most recent one was it was an Alberta First Nation that was using statues of Sir John A. Macdonald to block a pipeline because the white owners of the pipeline wouldn't dare tear down a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, so they placed it along the route. That was the most recent one and one of my favorites.
It reminds me of the headline you wrote about Justin Trudeau, where you said, "The guy who spent millions fighting First Nations kids in court, deeply disappointed over toppled statue."
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. I mean, that's what upsets you. You literally spent millions of dollars fighting kids that were asking for not more, but for equity. That, sometimes a lot of the stories, they're born out of anger. And that was a moment where it was born out of anger because it was so maddening to see this guy, of all the things, all of the things that are happening in the world right now, don't touch the statue. But I'll see you guys later. I gotta go to a court hearing with some First Nations kids right now. So I think that's what it was. It's true. A lot of Walking Eagle stories, they can be darkly funny, but a lot of them they're born out of this sort of knee-jerk reaction of anger to things that I see, and my mind automatically goes to sarcasm. And so that was my reaction, and that was the feeling that I had when I wrote that. And that's how I usually feel when I see a lot of stories, except for, I try to put some stories of joy in there, but a lot of times when you watch the news and you make fun of news and you parody the news, a lot of it, is it's rooted in anger.
Yeah. When you write a headline like "We warned you after statue removed, millions unable to remember name of Canada's first Prime Minister," on the surface it's really funny.
Yeah.
But it does point to something much deeper, a larger problem. And so, although it's funny, what do you want people to take from these headlines? Yeah,
to learn a bit about what the statues actually mean, right? I don't put much of that in the story. I think a lot of what the stories and the headlines that I write are feelings, right? They're an interpretation of how Indigenous people feel about these stories. And that's usually what it is it's my knee-jerk reaction to watching the news. So I think what I want people to realize is you're full of crap. You don't, this has nothing to do with you defending a statue and defending history, and everything to do with you just wanting us to shut up. So it's fun to make fun of them. And it's fun to also see because some people don't get that the stories are fake. So their reactions are even funnier than the story themselves. Because this one guy, Yeah, this one guy got really mad about the story about Sir John A. Macdonald stopping the pipeline. He was like, "Oh, it must be nice to have all this money to buy statues." And we used all of your taxpayer dollars to build them. So.
Oh, that's great. Why is this issue become so easy to make fun of?
Because it's so ridiculous. Like it's the sort of jokes that I make on the site are really not that much different than the actual defenses people have of statues, right? That the idea that we're somehow going to lose history because we tear down a statue that nobody looked at before. It's
so interesting because I think, like, they almost feel invisible, but not.
Yeah. I think what it is that they mean different things to different people. Mm-hmm. And so for Indigenous and people of color, these statues are reminders of a very painful past and present, right? Whereas for, non-Indigenous people in Canada, they're the ones that have the luxury of not being able to see them, I think, for a lot of times, because they just think, oh, it's either some old guy or it's somebody who, to use the phrase that they often use, is, somebody who tamed this country, right? Like that's often the people that get the statues made after them. So
Indigenous people often have very visceral reactions to these monuments,
Yes. And that's what the tearing down of statues is a visceral response to something that they've seen, right? Because ultimately it's not so much a meaningless act, but it is a reaction. It's a gut reaction. You see the symbol of what for some of us is probably hate, right? Like Sir John A. Macdonald was not a nice man, no matter what people will say about him. I mean, what he did to Indigenous children, we're still dealing with that today, right? In really serious ways. So, but it's a very visceral reaction to tear down that symbol, right? So it's almost like it means something to us to tear it down. And it's funny that it suddenly meant so much to people that didn't give a crap about them before.
If you had to pick a person or a thing or a moment to celebrate with a monument or a statue, what would you pick?
I've been trying to think about that, and I've been having a really hard time. I mean, it's so hard to pick. I mean, I want to pick something funny. Like, I want to pick these funny moments in history that could probably make an excellent statue. But sometimes you just want to go with somebody that's actually really inspiring, right? Like somebody like Cindy Blackstock, I think, would make an incredible statue. And she would probably hate to have a statue made of her, but I think that at least that's somebody who's actually done something, tangible and very real.
Thanks for being here, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Tim Fontaine is a writer and the editor-in-chief of the satirical website Walking Eagle News. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. We've been talking about monuments coming down on today's show. But what about when you come across someone who really deserves to be honored, to be remembered? That happened to Cindy Blackstock. She's the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada and a member of the Gitxsan First Nation. And she's been advocating for equal rights for Indigenous children and families for over 30 years. When she discovered the work of a non-Indigenous doctor sounding the alarm bells about what was happening in residential schools almost 100 years ago, Cindy knew she wanted to restore the legacy of Dr. Peter Bryce.
Dr. Bryce was a non-Indigenous man, and he was born just outside of Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve in a little town called Mount Pleasant.
He graduated medical school when Canada was only 9 years old. He was the founder of the Canadian Public Health Association and, in the early 1900s, became Chief Medical Health Officer at what was then called the Indian Department.
And the first task they give him is to send him out to study the health of the children in residential schools, because the top federal bureaucrat at that time, someone by the name of Duncan Campbell Scott, was already receiving reports that up to 50% of the children who were in the schools were dying there. And so they wanted to find out what was happening, and they sent Dr. Bryce out to do the study. He found that First Nations children in residential schools and First Nations writ large were receiving only 1/3 of the health funding of just the citizens of Ottawa. He submitted his report in 1907, and he really believed that Once he proved the problem and gave them a solution, the government of Canada would do the right thing. And the government refused to do it.
But Dr. Bryce didn't stay silent. His work ended up in newspapers across the country.
And the government was not pleased with this. So they began retaliating against him. They tried to disparage him. They cut all his research funding. They stopped him from presenting at academic conferences because they didn't want this news to get out. And eventually they pushed him out of the public service. But even then, he wasn't silent.
On a Tuesday in June in 2008, right before the government was set to apologize for its role in residential schools, Cindy made another remarkable discovery about Dr. Bryce.
I actually learned he was buried not far from me in Beechwood Cemetery. So I went and I got a bouquet of brightly colored Gerber daisies because they represented joy of children to me. And I went and I found his grave that is just down a little valley in front of a beautiful maple tree, an oak tree. And I told him about the Canadian human rights case that we had filed exactly 100 years after his 1907 report in 2007, alleging that Canada was discriminating against this generation of kids in ways that caused their harm and unnecessary family separations. And I wanted to thank him for everything that he did.
Cindy is now connected with his remaining family members, and she's the caretaker for Dr. Bryce's grave.
And now there's a historical plaque there so that kids can learn about Dr. Bryce and be inspired by him just as I was. Now when I go down there, I see poems and stones that people have placed on top of his monument. It's really clear that people are starting to appreciate, many years after he died, what he did and the example he set.
Cindy Blackstock is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. A professor at McGill University School of Social Work, she's a member of the Gitxsan First Nation. If you want to find out more about Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, head to our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. If you want to get in touch with us and let us know who you think should have a statue in Canada, you can find us on Facebook or Twitter. Unreserved is produced by Zoe Tennant, Kyle Musica, Stephanie Cram, and Anna Lazowski. I'm Phelan Johnson. Thanks, and Nyawagoa for listening.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.